Hello, friends, and welcome to this series where we are talking about object oriented programming concepts, design, and implementation. Today, we are going to discuss one more object oriented design pattern called as facade pattern. So, we'll start our discussion with our favorite example, Age of Empires. So, Age of Empires is a or was a computer game. It's a strategy game developed by Microsoft Studios where each player has to develop his or her own cities, own kingdom, own armies, citizens, and all that. And then they have to fight wars with other players and their cities, and eventually, whoever defeats everyone wins the game, right? When you just start playing the game, right, you don't know at that moment of time how many other players are playing the game or and where exactly are they situated and how much strength there is in their armies or how many citizens or how many military buildings these other players have. So it usually looks like if you remember, right, so this is a computer screen, right? So you start playing in this area somewhere, right? You're placed in this area, so you have to create your buildings here, and your walls maybe, right? And these other players, most of the times played by computer, are either here, here, or could be here, or could be somewhere here, right? Initially, you don't see this area at all. This is all black. This is all black to you, right? You don't see this. You only get exposed to this area, right? So it is advisable while you are building your infrastructure and army to explore these other players, and so that you know the most ideal routes for attacking them, plan your strategy accordingly, right? So that is called as scouting. So you have to explore the area. You have to know your opponents, where are they situated, and their strengths and their weaknesses, right? So now the scouting is usually done in Age of Empires using a scout. So what is a scout? Scout is a horse rider, basically. Once you create your stable, you can create a scout. Once you create a scout, that scout is like this guy, right, on a horse. You can point it here, then he will ride here. Then you can point it here, then he can ride it here. So as you keep on traveling your scout, more area becomes visible to you, right? More and more area becomes visible to you as your scout progresses. So you keep on pointing him forward and forward until he actually reaches the city walls of the opponent, right? So that is traditionally how scouting is done in Age of Empires, right? And you have to keep that activity going on parallelly while you are building your infrastructure, like you're generating your army or training them or citizens and gathering food and all those activities, right? So let's look at how this code will look like. Let's keep our client here, right? So client in this case is player. First thing we need to do is, in order to create a scout, is to have a stable. So you could say stable C equal to new stable, and the entity involved here is stable, right? Stable class. So you'll create a stable, right? That is step one. So once you have a stable, now you can create a scout. So you'll say scout S equal to new scout. So next thing you create is a scout. Once you create a scout, now you have to point him to some position where he has to ride in order to explore more area. So you have to say s dot ride, some method, right? And you'll have to provide some location, right? Once he does that, he reaches that location, right? You get more area visible to you. So you have to again repeat this step and say ride again to location 2, right? Again, keep on doing that to explore more and more area, right? Now, it's not that easy, right? When you are entering a unknown territory, enemy area, there might be enemy soldiers who are guarding their area, right? So your scout is unarmed. Scout is unarmed. So your scout may come under attack. So in that case, it's advisable to create a paladin, a warrior riding a horse, a paladin, So let's say we'll create a paladin. Let's say paladin P equal to new paladin. So we'll have one paladin. So paladin has to now follow the scout in order to be able to protect the scout in case the scout comes under attack, right? So we'll say P dot follow. Here it has to follow the scout. So scout object like Brian is protecting Arya and Sansa, right? In case you reach a point where your paladins and scouts reach that enemy territory, now enemy territory is visible, right? You want them back. So you will have to write something like, okay, scout dot return, right? And scout returns, so paladin is following, so paladin will also return, right? So this is all you need to do, right? A player has to do these activities manually. So basically, when player is doing all this using the interface, clicking the mouse and generating the objects, the behind the scene code is pretty much like this, right? So this is all being done to carry out a task of scouting, right? So scouting is the task, and in order to carry out this task, we are creating all these objects and writing all this code. It doesn't stop here. This was the most optimistic case, right? Now, there are complications. For example, your scout can get killed, right? Yes, paladin is trying to save the scout, but both can get killed under heavy attack from the enemy, right? So that is one problem. Second problem, the scout and paladin might come into a point of area where there is a river, right? So there is a river, here are your scout and paladin. Now, in order to explore further, they have to cross the river, but they are both on horses and they can't cross the river. So your scouting mission is now halfway through, right? And in the meantime, you have to also pay attention to your own city infrastructure and everything. So you don't even know at times that your scout and paladin are stuck there, right? So that is one more problem. And you somehow reach the enemy territory. So this is enemy territory, right? So you see these enemy buildings, enemy castles and everything. Now the problem is your scout reaches here and paladin, right? So there are walls now. So you can only partially see the enemy territory. You want to explore it to fullest, right? So again, you have to start new activity of, you have to, as I said, this step. Scout.ride, you have to keep pointing him to this position, this, and hope that there's a breach in the security or there's a gap in the walls of the enemy territory, and hopefully your scout can sneak into that gap and explore the enemy territory in full, right? That is one more issue. So lots of issues, lots of manual actions have to be taken by the player, the user, right? And meanwhile, as you are doing all these activities, you as a player might come under attack from other enemies, right? So you might lose track of these scouting activities and they might get killed eventually. Yeah. So it's a pretty tedious task, I would say, right? Now, what if this complex system of scouting, can we simplify it? I'm a developer, I'm a designer, program designer, and we have object-oriented programming at our disposal. So can we simplify these things for our users, for our players? Yes, certainly we can. And for that, we are going to use Facade Pattern. So this code now will make it simpler for client. So Facade Pattern is used in order to create a higher level simplified interface in order to access a complex subsystem, right? So I'll explain that, don't worry. So instead of writing this code, what I'm going to provide to my users are, I'm going to create an entity class called as Scouting Facade. And I'm going to go one step ahead and create a composition here. Scouting mechanism, right? I'm going to compose an object S, right? And this scouting facade will have methods like start scouting, stop scouting, get scouting report. It's like a remote control. It's like I'm giving you access to a functionality, a complex functionality through a simpler interface. You remember the video where we were discussing object-oriented programming concepts, and I was explaining the air conditioner example of air conditioner and the remote, why it is given to you. So it's very similar to that, right? So this is my facade class, right? And the client code, right, is going to be now much simpler. So the client code will not be this much complex, and we'll say, so this is my client code. Code will be dependent on the actions taken by the player, the user, end user. So I'll say, I'll just create a scouting facade. Right? So he will click on so there will be a toolbar, right, on the bottom of the screen for user, and he just have to say scouting mission. He has to select the scouting mission. It will create a scouting facade object, s equal to new scouting facade. Now, based on the era in which the user is playing, there are eras in the game of in the Age of Empires. So you have medieval age, you have modern age, you have ancient age, and once you generate sufficient resources like food, silver, and gold, you can choose to transform yourself from one era to another, right? If you have played that game, you know this. So there are different eras, right? So why I'm talking about them? So once you create this scouting facade object in your client code, according to the era that you are in, the player is in, the scouting facade will generate a concrete implementation for this composed scouting mechanism. So scouting mechanisms could be scout based, right? It could be, if you're in modern era, then it could be drone based. Yeah. It could be motor based, like you have vehicles, not so modern, but Newton era, right? So motor based scouting. So there are different concrete implementations of scouting mechanisms. Scout based, that is horse based, drone based, the ultra modern era, and motor based, using a car or tank or something like that, right? So that will be decided according to the era in which player is playing. So the constructor of the scouting facade code will initialize this S to one of these concrete implementation. But client doesn't have to bother about it. Client just has to create a scouting facade object and say s dot start scouting, right? If this is your screen, right, this is where you are situated, you can just click on the mouse that in this direction you want to scout. So better, let's say, call it as direction. So you just have to specify the direction in which you want to scout. So you just have to click on that direction and it will start scouting. And at any point of time, you feel like you can say s dot generate report. And you can also say s dot stop scouting if you want to stop scouting, right? So this is it. This is all you got to do. As a player, you don't have to worry about creating a scout, creating a paladin, pointing them to next locations so that they can eventually reach the enemy territory. You don't have to worry about that at all. That all those activities will be taken care by the code that we are going to write in this start scouting method. Now let's look at the code of start scouting method, right? That we are going to call, right, from client. So I'll write it here. It has a direction, right, as a parameter. Now, this facade class has a composed scouting mechanism object who will be initialized to one of the concrete mechanisms based on the era of the player, right? So once you have that initialization done, right, in the constructor of this, we can just say s dot start scouting. So there will be start scouting method in each of these concrete implementations, right? So let's take an example of this, like horse-based scouting, right? So this method basically, which will be called here, will be something like this. So it will create first a scout, right? So it will create this entity. Then it will create a paladin, right? So it will create this entity for you. Then whatever scout, let's say this object is S and this is P. So S dot start exploring, right? And it will use the direction. Then it will say P dot follow, right? So all that code which we were earlier writing in the client side that player had to do manually, now we are putting inside this scouting mechanisms. So we are hiding those implementation details from the end client. That's what we are doing. We are making it simpler for the end client, right? What are the advantages of doing that, right? What are the advantages? First, a facade can add its own smart code. It can add the additional functionality to the existing earlier code. For example, you remember I said there might be a river, right? While you are scouting, you might come across a river, right? And you can't cross it because only you have got horses. So here, our scouting mechanisms can anticipate that. So let's say if river, create a boat. So they can create a boat for you, right? The boat will sail here. These two will get in that boat, sail here, get out of the boat and continue scouting. That code we can write here, right? User doesn't even have to know. All user is doing is that create a facade object, say start scouting and say west, east or north or northeast, northwest. That's it. All the obstacles in the scouting will be anticipated, will be taken care for in your scouting mechanism codes, right? User doesn't even have to bother about the scouting mechanism. We can choose drone if user is in the ultra modern era. We can choose motor based or tank based if he or she is playing in modern era, or we can use the old style horse based if the user currently is in medieval age, right? So all these details are hidden and we can add so much code. We can take care of all these situations. Let's say scout gets killed, paladin also gets killed. So our scouting code will automatically generate another scout, another paladin and restart the scouting process. But this we are talking about functional terms. The most important thing that you can see is we are decoupling the client code from the actual implementation, right? This is the actual implementation, all this. We are decoupling the client from it. The advantage is that we can change this code tomorrow. We can change the behavior of these scouting mechanisms and client doesn't have to know. The client code doesn't have to change. It remains the same. It has to just start the scouting mission, stop the scouting mission and get the report. Meanwhile, we can change a lot of code here. We can add some new possibilities. What if this, what if that, what if this, what if that to the code. But it is loosely coupled. So we don't have to change the client code. So facade pattern says that for your complex subsystem, right, which you are currently using through invoking methods and object creation in your client code, create a simplified interface. Create a simplified interface for that complex subsystem and give access to the functionality of that complex intended functionality of that complex subsystem to your client through easy to use interface, easy to use methods. This is your facade pattern. One more advantage, the way facade works is it doesn't completely hide the participating entities from the end client, right? So despite using facade, the client, that is the player, can still create a individual scout. Apart from this facade mission, he can still choose to go for individual scout. Let's say for some other purpose, for keeping a watch on his own territory, he can still create a paladin. So he can still access the individual components of the subsystem for which facade was created. So it's not like now that you have facade, you can't generate your own scout or you can't generate paladin or stable or any of this, or drone. Let's say we have a drone class. You can still have your own drone. That is one more advantage with facade. It doesn't restrict you from accessing the individual components of the subsystem for which the facade was created. Eventually, facade follows the object-oriented design principle of least knowledge. So what is least knowledge principle? Least knowledge principle says you should only talk to your immediate friend object. So here, this client code object is only talking to a initial or immediate friend object. That's it. It is restricting the communication to single object. And then that object can take care of other objects, right? So that is what principle of least knowledge is better explained as low coupling, high cohesion that you have heard of, right? So this was facade pattern. I strongly recommend using facade pattern when you are writing business applications. Make it as easy as possible for the end user to consume your complex services. Give them simplified interfaces. Give them simplified ways of accessing your complex system. That is it for facade pattern. I will see you in the next video where we will discuss one more of this object-oriented design patterns. Thank you.